People who pass through Bitterroot Crossing these days see a quiet town with a paved road and a filling station and not much else worth slowing down for. They stop for gasoline or water and move on without knowing what the ground beneath their tires once held, without any sense that the families who survived the winter of 1886 did so in large part because of a Norwegian widow who bought an unreasonable quantity of dried grass from my store in October of that year and said nothing to anyone about what she intended to do with it. My name is Hester Vane. I have kept the general store in Bitterroot Crossing since my husband passed in 1901, and I have been here long enough to know the difference between history and what gets written down as history. Those are not always the same country. I am telling you this in August of 1921, which means I am telling it 35 years after the fact, which means I have had 35 years to consider what I saw and what I failed to do about it in any timely fashion. The young man sitting across from me with his notebook open came from Helena, looking for a story about women who built Montana. He stopped here because his automobile needed water. I gave him water. He mentioned a name, Maren Solberg, and I set down what I was doing and looked at him for a moment in the particular way that older people look at younger people who are about to receive more than they came for. I told him to close his notebook and open it again. What I was going to tell him was not the kind of story that fits neatly between the lines a person fills in when they already think they know the shape of the thing. He closed it. He opened it again. He pulled up the chair closer to the counter. I began. The autumn of 1886 arrived in Montana with a quality that the animals understood before the people did. I am not a superstitious woman, and I am not telling you this to make the story feel larger than it was. I am telling you because it is true and because the details matter when you are trying to explain how an entire settlement failed to prepare adequately for what was coming, despite every sign that something extraordinary was bearing down on them from the north. The horses were eating urgently in August. Not hungrily, horses are often hungry, but urgently, with a focused, almost anxious consumption that the men who worked them noticed and mentioned to one another without drawing any particular conclusion. The geese flew south 3 weeks ahead of their usual calendar. The creek near the Halverson place froze at the edges in late October, which I had not seen in my 12 years in Bitterroot Crossing, and which the old-timers said they had not seen since a winter they did not like to discuss. And the cold itself, when it came down from the mountains in November, had a character that was different from ordinary winter cold. I know that sounds like the sort of thing people say after the fact, when they are trying to explain why they did not act sooner. But I had been observing cold for a long time by then, and there was something in that autumn air, a consistency, a refusal to soften even in the middle of the day, that sat differently than the cold I had catalogued in the years before it. Most people in Bitterroot Crossing responded to these signs by doing what people do when they are frightened and have no specific knowledge to act on. They did what they had always done, only more of it. They cut more wood. They bought more salt pork. They checked their root cellars, found them structurally identical to the root cellars that had served them adequately in previous winters, and concluded that they were prepared. They were not prepared. But I am getting ahead of the story. Maren Solberg had come to Montana Territory with her husband Eric in 1882. They had filed a homestead claim on 160 acres of good grassland 7 miles north of Bitterroot Crossing. Built a cabin from timber they hauled themselves, dug a root cellar in the second summer, and begun the slow, specific work of proving up a piece of land that had never been cultivated and that the country was not going to cooperate with simply because they needed it to. Eric Solberg was a large, careful man who had grown up in Hardanger, watching his father work other men's soil for 40 years. He understood what it meant to own ground. He understood it with the particular intensity of someone for whom ownership had always been theoretical until the moment it was not, and he brought that intensity to every task the homestead required of him: the fencing, the planting, the construction, the long daily work of turning a claim into something that could sustain a life. He died in January of 1885. Pneumonia, which announced itself as a cough on a Monday and finished its business by Thursday of the same week. He had been cutting wood that morning. He had been fine, in the way that healthy men of 36 are fine, completely, unremarkably fine. And then he was not, and then he was gone, and Maren was left with 160 acres of Montana ground, a root cellar built to the specifications Eric had learned from the other men in the settlement, and a homestead claim that would expire worthless if she could not prove it up by the spring of the following year. 3 men came to her within 2 weeks of the funeral with offers to purchase the claim. She thanked each of them and said she would consider it. She did not consider it. She had not come across an ocean to stand in a country where the ground was hers and sell it to men who assumed she could not manage it. That was not a complicated decision for Maren Solberg. It was simply what the facts required. What the facts also required by the autumn of 1886 was a root cellar that could keep food alive through a winter she had decided, on the evidence of the horses and the geese and the particular quality of the October cold, was going to be unlike the winters she had stored against before. I should tell you something about how Maren arrived at this concern, because it reflects the kind of mind she had, and because it matters to everything that came after. She was not a woman who worked from intuition, though people who did not know her well sometimes mistook her silence for a kind of instinct-driven simplicity. She worked from observation. She kept track of things, temperatures, dates, the behavior of her animals, the depth at which the ground froze in different parts of her property, the way moisture moved through the walls of the cabin in cold weather. She did not write most of this down because she had no system for writing that felt adequate to what she was observing, but she held it in her memory with considerable precision. In the second week of October 1886, she performed an experiment so straightforward that I am slightly embarrassed, in retrospect, that none of the rest of us thought to do it. She took 3 glass jars, filled each one with water, and placed them at 3 different points in her root cellar. One she set against the north wall, where the plank lining met the earth. One she placed in the center of the cellar floor. One she set near the cellar door, in the corner where the frame met the ground. In the morning, she went down to look at them. The jar in the center of the floor was liquid and clear. The jar near the door had frozen solid overnight, not the slow freezing of water that cools gradually, but the rapid, complete freeze of water that has been exposed to something much colder than the room it sits in. The jar against the north wall had a skin of ice on the side that touched the plank, and the water behind that skin was cloudy with cold, not yet frozen, but close. Maren stood in her root cellar for a long time looking at those 3 jars. She was not a physicist. She did not use words like thermal conductivity or frost line penetration, but she understood what she was seeing with the precision of a woman who had spent 4 Montana winters paying close attention to where the cold came from and how it moved. The cold was not filling the room. The cold was entering through surfaces, through the walls where the planks met the earth, through the door frame where the wood had shrunk away from the ground. The center of the cellar was protected by the air itself, the still, quiet air that sat in the middle of the space and was not touching anything cold. It was the surfaces that were failing her, the surfaces and the door. She went back to the cabin and sat with this for several days. She understood the problem now with considerable clarity. What she did not yet have was a solution. She came into my store that week and asked me something that nobody had ever asked me before. She wanted to know if I kept records of how deep the creek had frozen in the winters I had been in Bitterroot Crossing, not the temperature, the depth of the freeze. I did not have those records. She thanked me and bought her ordinary supplies: dried beans, salt, lamp oil, a spool of thread, and then she stood at the counter for a moment longer than the transaction required. Her English was careful and considered, not hesitant but deliberate, the way it is with people who are translating in their heads as they go and have decided that accuracy is worth more than speed. She said, I need to know if anyone in this area has built a root cellar that does not freeze in a very cold winter, not one that freezes less, one that does not freeze. I thought about this. I named 2 or 3 men who kept good cellars. She shook her head slightly. She had already asked them, and their cellars had frozen in cold years, only less severely than cellars built without care. That was not what she was asking about. I said I didn't know of anyone. Then, because I was watching her face, I said, Agnes Tremblay might know. Agnes knows things about this valley that the rest of us have not learned yet. Maren nodded and picked up her supplies and walked out to her cart. I watched her drive north through the window. I sold the grass to her 3 weeks later, not yet understanding what it was for, and I did not ask. This is one of the things I have to live with, that I was present for the beginning of this story and curious enough to watch, but not curious enough to inquire, and the difference between those 2 things cost the record something that took 35 years to partially recover. Dorothy Crane stopped in to see me 2 days after Maren's visit. Dorothy was the wife of Thomas Crane, who chaired the settlement's land committee and who had been one of the 3 men to approach Maren with a purchase offer after Eric's funeral. Dorothy was a woman of genuine capability and genuine warmth, who had organized the settlement's first school, its lending library, and its system of mutual aid for families in difficulty. She was not a cruel person. I want to be precise about that because the story is easier to tell if she is simply the villain of it, and she was not. She told me she was thinking about stopping by the Solberg claim to check on the widow before winter set in properly. She said it with the specific kindness of a woman who has decided what another woman needs and is already planning how to deliver it. I said Maren seemed to be managing. Dorothy said, she is managing the way people manage when they haven't yet understood what they are managing against. She has no husband and no sons, and her English is difficult, and she is alone on a claim that a family of 4 would find hard work in a winter like this one is going to be. Kindness requires that we say these things clearly rather than let a woman freeze out of some misplaced notion of respecting her pride. I said I understood her concern. She went to call on Maren the following Tuesday. She came back and told several people, including me, that the widow Solberg did not appear to have adequately prepared for the winter. She had seen the cellar door and found it thin. She had mentioned, gently, that there were families in the Powder River Basin who had taken in widows in similar situations, and that Thomas knew of arrangements that could be made if Maren found herself overwhelmed. She had offered this as practical assistance, and Maren had thanked her for the visit and asked about the road conditions coming back south, which Dorothy took to mean the conversation was finished. What Dorothy did not know, what none of us knew yet, was that Maren had already measured the problem with 3 jars of water, had already concluded that the solution would require something none of the men in the settlement had tried, and had already begun looking for a teacher. She found one. But that is the next part of the story, and I want to make sure you understand something first. The knowledge that saved Maren Solberg's cellar, that saved the food, that saved the land, that saved eventually 11 families in this settlement and more beyond it, was not discovered that winter. It was not new. It was not invented by a Norwegian widow or a Swedish immigrant or anyone else who had come to Montana from somewhere else with good intentions and not enough firewood. It was here before we arrived. It had been here for a very long time, and the woman who held it was 2 miles past the lower creek, in a camp that every person in Bitterroot Crossing had ridden past without stopping for 15 years, because they had already decided there was nothing there worth the interruption of their journey. Her name was Strikes the Water. I want you to write that down before I tell you anything else. Agnes Tremblay lived 2 miles north of Maren Solberg on a claim her father had filed in 1873, when the country was newer and the winters had not yet demonstrated the full range of what they were capable of. Her mother had been Cree, from a family that had moved between Montana and the Canadian territories for generations, and Agnes had grown up with 1 foot in the settlement's understanding of the land and 1 foot in an older understanding that the settlement had largely decided was not relevant to its purposes. She was 28 years old in the autumn of 1886 with 4 children and a husband named Remy, who trapped the Upper Valley from October through March and trusted Agnes to manage everything in his absence, which was not a small trust and which Agnes honored without complaint, because complaint was not something she found particularly useful. Maren rode to her claim on a Thursday afternoon in mid-October, 3 days after the experiment with the 3 jars of water. She arrived without announcement, which was not unusual between neighbors in that part of Montana, and found Agnes splitting kindling behind the house with the competent, unhurried rhythm of a woman who has been splitting kindling since before she was old enough to do it well, and has long since made peace with the task. Agnes set down her axe and looked at Maren with the particular attentiveness of someone who has learned to read visitors quickly, because visitors arrive with needs that are not always the needs they announce. Maren said, "I need to find someone who has kept food through a very cold winter without losing it. Not someone who lost less, someone who lost nothing." Agnes considered this for a moment. She asked what kind of cold Maren was preparing for. Maren described the horses, the geese, the depth of the frost she had measured against her fence posts in the first week of October. Agnes listened without interrupting, which was one of the things Maren valued about her. She did not fill silences with reassurance when what the silence required was thought. Agnes said, "There is a woman past the lower creek who has been wintering in this valley longer than any of us. Her cellars, the cache pits her people make, I have never heard of them failing, not in any winter." Maren asked where exactly. Agnes gave her the direction. Then she said carefully, "She may not speak to you. She has reasons for that which are not difficult to understand if you think about them for a moment. If she does not speak to you, I would not take it personally, but I also would not stop trying." Maren thanked her and rode home. She sat with the information for 2 days before she went. I want to describe the 3 visits, because each one was different, and together they form a kind of education that I think about when I consider how knowledge actually travels between people, not through explanation, not through instruction, but through the patient accumulation of presence. The first visit, Strikes the Water, did not acknowledge Maren at all. Maren rode out on a Saturday morning and found the camp without difficulty. A small, well-kept space near a creek bend, with a structure that was clearly permanent in a way that had nothing to do with size, a fire maintained at a precise and economical level, and an old woman working at the edge of the camp with her back to the path. She was perhaps 70 years old, or perhaps older. Her age was not something her body advertised in any simple way. She moved with the specific economy of someone who has learned that every movement costs something and has therefore arranged her movements to cost as little as possible. Maren stopped her horse at a respectful distance and waited. The old woman continued working. After a time, Maren turned and rode home. She came back on Tuesday. The second visit, Strikes the Water, looked at her once. A single, direct look of clear assessment, the kind of look that takes in a great deal of information very quickly and renders a verdict that is not yet announced. Then she returned to what she was doing. Maren stayed for half an hour, watching from her distance, and rode home again. She came back on Friday. This time, something was different. Maren could not have said exactly what. The distance was the same, the quiet was the same, but she had the strong sense, she told me later, that she was being permitted to be there in a way that had not been true on the first 2 visits. She dismounted and tied her horse and sat down on a flat rock at the edge of the camp, not close, not far, and watched. Strikes the Water was working on a cache pit. I should explain what a cache pit is, because most people in Bitterroot Crossing in 1886 would not have known, and their not knowing was one of the more expensive gaps in their education. The Apsaalooke people, the Crow, had been wintering in Montana ground for longer than any European calendar had been keeping track of Montana winters. They had developed, through that long accumulation of winters, a system of food storage that was not built against the cold so much as it was built in conversation with it. A cache pit was dug into the earth to a specific depth, not merely deep, but precisely deep, calibrated to the point where the ground's own stable temperature began to assert itself against the temperature above. Then its walls were lined, not with wood, not with plank and earth, the way the settlers built their root cellars, trusting the structural material to provide the insulation, with grass. Dry prairie grass, packed against every wall surface at a thickness that Strikes the Water was now demonstrating with her hands. Not packed hard, not pressed flat, but pressed to a specific firmness that left give in it, a slight resistance when you pushed a finger in, a sense of depth that solid packing would not have. 4 inches of this grass maintained at this specific density against every wall surface. Then a cover of the same material for the top, and an entry designed in 2 stages. An outer door, a small enclosed space, an inner door, so that cold air entering the first door had somewhere to go that was not the interior of the pit itself. Maren watched all of this. She watched for a long time. At some point, Strikes the Water paused and looked at her, and in the look was a question that did not require translation. Do you understand what you are seeing, or are you simply watching? Maren stood up from the rock and walked closer. She crouched down and looked at the grass in the wall and reached out a hand and pressed it gently, feeling the give, feeling the depth. She pressed harder and felt the grass compress and felt, in the compressed state, that the thing she was pressing had lost something essential, had become, under her palm, something dense and cold instead of something with interior air in it. She released the pressure and the grass slowly recovered. She looked up at Strikes the Water. She pressed again, gently this time. Not enough to compress, just enough to feel the surface. Then she looked up again. Strikes the Water said one word, in Apsaluki, which Maren did not speak. But the word, Maren tried to describe it to me years later, the sound of it, had in it something that resembled the sound for still or the sound for air, or possibly for a combination of both that the Apsaluki language held together as a single concept, and that English required 2 words to approximate and still did not capture exactly. Maren told me she thought about that word every winter for the rest of her life. She came back to my store the following week and bought the first 10 bales of grass. I noted the purchase in my ledger and did not ask why she wanted bedding material in that quantity when she had only 1 milk cow and 4 chickens. I was busy with the pre-winter rush, and she was Maren Solberg, who had never bought anything from me that she did not have a purpose for. She came back 5 days later and bought 15 more bales. I watched her load them onto her cart with the focused efficiency that characterized everything she did, and I thought briefly about asking, and then I did not, and she drove north. The third purchase, 10 bales, came a week after that. It was only when I added up the quantities in my ledger at the end of the month, 35 bales of dried prairie grass, purchased by a single woman with no obvious livestock need, that I understood she was building something. I still did not know what. The construction took 9 days. I know this because Agnes told me, and Agnes knew because she came by the Solberg claim twice during the work and watched and asked questions and filed away the answers with the particular attention of a woman who is already thinking about how she will explain this to other people later. Maren began by removing everything Eric had built inside the root cellar, the plank lining along the walls, the simple wooden shelf, the single-door entry. She worked from the inside out, pulling nails and stacking the lumber neatly outside. She was not wasteful, and the planks had other uses, until she was left with the original hole in the earth, 4 walls of bare dirt, and the crude framing of the door. Then she began packing the grass. The first wall took most of a day. She worked in sections, pressing the grass against the earth in layers, using thin pine slats salvaged from the removed lining to hold each layer against the wall while the next one went in. The slats were spaced every 18 inches. The grass behind them was pressed to the resistance she had felt in Strikes the Water's cache pit, that specific give, that interior depth, the density of something that had air inside it. She finished the first section and pressed her palm flat against it and held it there. She could feel nothing cold, not warm, not heated, simply not cold. The surface of the grass was the temperature of the room, which was the temperature of still earth, which was the temperature of a space that the cold had not yet entered. The plank wall behind the grass was touching the cold earth. The cold was there. But between the plank and her hand were 4 inches of grass that could not move, air that was trapped inside dry fiber and could not circulate, and the cold from the plank had entered that dead air and stopped. She stood there for some time with her palm against the grass. Then she went upstairs and ate supper and came back down and stood in the cellar until the lamp began to burn low. She did the second wall the next morning. The failure came on the 4th day. She was working on the north wall, the wall that faced the Canadian wind directly, the wall she had decided would need the most careful work, and she pressed too hard. She was tired, and she was cold, and she was working faster than she should have been because the calendar was pressing against her from the outside as certainly as the cold pressed through the earth, and her hands compressed a section of grass to a density that was solid rather than firm, packed rather than present. She did not notice it that evening. She noticed it the next morning when she pressed her palm against the north wall in the way she had begun doing each morning to check her work, and felt through the grass in that one section the faint trace of cold that should not have been there, not much. A suggestion, the kind of cold that means a thin place in the wall, a compromise in the insulation, a point where the air was dense enough to transfer temperature instead of stopping it. She stood looking at that wall for a long time. Then she pulled the slats out of that section, stripped out the grass, and repacked it. Slower. Less pressure. She took nearly twice as long on the repacking as she had on the original work, and when she pressed her palm against it again, the cold was gone. This moment matters more than it might seem. It would have been entirely reasonable, given the time pressure and the physical difficulty of the work, to leave the compromise section and hope it would be adequate. Most people would have. Most people build to standards that are close enough because close enough is what the circumstances allow, and because perfection is the enemy of done. And they are not wrong to think this way. But Maren Solberg had 3 jars of water that had taught her exactly where close enough stopped working. She had measured the problem with enough precision to know that the north wall was the wall that would be tested hardest, and she had packed it wrong, and packing it wrong meant the cold would find that point and use it, and she had not spent 9 days in a root cellar in October to hand the cold a door. She repacked the section. She moved on. By the 8th day, the walls were finished. On the 9th, she built the entry vestibule, a small enclosed space between an outer door and an inner one, 18 inches of airlock that cold air could fill without reaching the cellar proper. She used the lumber from Eric's plank lining for the frame and lined the vestibule walls with the last of the grass. The inner door was heavier than the outer one, padded along its edges with strips of wool from a blanket she had worn out the previous winter. She put a single jar of water in the cellar that evening, set it against the north wall, the same position as the jar that had shown her the problem in the first place. Then she went upstairs and did not go back down until morning. The jar was liquid and clear. Maren stood in the cellar with the lamp and turned the jar in her hands and looked at the water, which was cold but not frozen, which was exactly what water in a properly functioning cellar should be. Cold because the earth was cold, not frozen because the earth's cold had been stopped at the grass wall and could go no further. She set the jar down carefully, as though putting it down too hard might break something. Then she went upstairs and began moving the root vegetables down from the cabin where they had been stored while she worked. Potatoes, carrots, turnips. The cabbages she had put up in brine and clay pots. The dried apples wrapped in cloth. The things that would keep her alive from November to April if they stayed cold and did not freeze, and that would be gray and soft and useless if the cellar failed her. She moved all of it down in one long afternoon, working steadily, not rushing, the way she did everything. The first snow came 4 days later. She was ready. The first snow came on a Wednesday. By Friday it was gone, melted off by a brief warmth that the old-timers recognized not as mercy, but as the particular deceit of a Montana autumn that is gathering itself for something larger. The ground froze that weekend and did not fully thaw again until April. I watched November arrive from behind my store counter the way I watched most things in those years, with the attentiveness of a woman whose business depended on understanding what people needed before they knew they needed it, and with the particular helplessness of a witness who could observe clearly and act on very little. The pre-winter traffic through my store told its own story. Families buying in quantities that reflected anxiety rather than calculation. Men purchasing additional lamp oil and additional salt and additional everything, not because they had run the numbers and found themselves short, but because the numbers felt unstable in a way they could not quantify. And buying more of things was the available response to that feeling. I sold more in October and November of 1886 than I had in any comparable period since I opened the store. I should have found this reassuring. I did not. The volume of purchasing felt less like preparation and more like a community trying to spend its way out of a fear it could not name precisely. Maren Solberg was not among the anxious buyers. She came in once in November for lamp oil and a length of wool cord, paid for both, and asked me if I had noticed anything unusual about the birds at the creek in the past week. I told her I had not been to the creek. She said the ducks that usually wintered on the slower water had moved south 2 weeks early, and that the ones that remained were sitting differently than she had ever seen ducks sit in November, close together still, conserving in a way that felt less like ordinary winter behavior and more like a specific response to a specific threat. I wrote this down in my ledger that evening, next to the inventory entries for her lamp oil and wool cord. I do not know exactly why. It seemed important to record, even though I could not have said at the time what it was important for. Dorothy Crane came by in the second week of November to tell me she had visited Maren again. She described the visit with the careful precision of a woman constructing a case. Not maliciously, I want to be clear about that, but with the genuine conviction of someone who had looked at a situation and rendered a judgment she believed was correct and was now marshaling the evidence that supported it. She had seen the cellar door, which was heavier than before and which had, around its frame, what appeared to be strips of wool padding that Maren had nailed into the wood. She had noted that the inside of the door vestibule, the small enclosed space between the outer and inner entry, which was new and which Dorothy had not seen on her previous visit, smelled of dried grass and closed air in a way she found unusual. She had not gone fully inside the cellar because Maren had not invited her further. She had asked about the food stores, and Maren had said they were adequate. She had asked about the wood supply, and Maren had said it was adequate. She had asked about arrangements for the winter, whether Maren had someone to check on her in extreme cold, whether she had a plan for reaching the settlement if she needed help. And Maren had said yes to both questions without specifying what the arrangements were. Dorothy sat across my counter and folded her hands and said, "She is managing, but she is managing alone, and she is managing strangely, and I cannot decide whether I am looking at a capable woman or a woman who is too proud to admit she is not capable." I said, "Those two things are not always as different as we assume." Dorothy looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "Thomas thinks someone should have a formal conversation with her about the land before spring, not to pressure her, simply to make sure she understands her options." I said I thought Maren understood her options with considerable clarity. Dorothy left without pursuing it further. But the fact of the conversation, that Thomas Crane was already thinking about the land, already positioning his committee for a spring discussion with the widow Solberg, sat in the back of my mind for the rest of November like a stone in a boot, present at every step, not incapacitating, but not ignorable. December arrived and the cold settled in with a permanence that distinguished it from any December I had experienced in Bitterroot Crossing. I want to describe this carefully because the temptation when writing about extreme cold is to make it dramatic, to give it the quality of an assault, a violence, something that announces itself and demands a response. The cold of December 1886 was not like that. It was patient. It came in steadily from the northwest, and it did not leave. Temperatures that in ordinary winters might last a day or two before relenting held for a week. Then 2 weeks, then simply became the new condition of the world, the baseline against which warmer days were measured, rather than the extreme against which normal days were measured. The creek froze solid in the 3rd week of December. Not at the edges, not with a skim of ice over moving water, solid to the bottom, in a way that left the surface looking less like frozen water than like gray stone that had always been there. The settlement adjusted. People burned more wood, as they had expected to. They reduced their trips between buildings to preserve body heat. They developed the particular indoor economy of a community wintering hard. The way social calls got shorter and more purposeful, the way you stopped going to the store for small things and started batching your trips. The way the conversations, when you did go out, had a focused quality, stripped of the social cushioning that warmer months permitted. I kept the store heated to a temperature that cost me more wood than I had budgeted for, because my store was the place people came when the cabin walls closed in on them, and that function seemed worth the fuel. I watched people come in red-faced from the cold and stand near the stove without speaking for a few minutes before they were ready to talk. I watched the particular arithmetic of anxiety work itself across faces that had come in hoping for news that things were leveling off and were getting, instead, the news that they were not. Agnes Tremblay stopped in twice in December, once to buy cornmeal and once simply to stand by the stove, which I understood. Her children were well. Her food stores were holding. She said Maren's lamp was visible most evenings from the north side of Agnes's claim, which meant Maren was home and the stove was running, and things were, as far as could be determined from 2 miles of frozen distance, adequate. I asked Agnes what she knew about the cellar. She told me what she had seen on her visits, the grass-lined walls, the double entry, the specific way Maren had packed the material to leave interior air in it rather than compress it to solidity. She described the temperature inside the cellar on her last visit in late November as notably different from any cellar she had been in before. Not warm, but a kind of stable cool that had no edge to it, no threat, none of the specific chill that came off surfaces that were conducting cold from the earth. I asked who had taught her to build it. Agnes said, "The woman past the creek, strikes the water." I wrote that name in my ledger that day. I am not entirely sure why I did it then. She had bought things from me before, and I had noted her name in the transaction records, but this felt like a different kind of notation. It felt like something I needed to make sure existed somewhere. The second cold wave came in January. I have told people about this winter many times over the years, and I have found that the difficulty is not in finding the words for how cold it was, there are plenty of words for cold, but in conveying the specific quality of that January as a duration rather than an event. It was not a cold snap. It was not a storm that came through and did its damage and left. It was a temperature that arrived and stayed and stayed and continued staying with a consistency so complete that after the first week people stopped waiting for it to moderate and began instead to think about whether their structures and stores could sustain it indefinitely. The answer for most of the settlement was that they could not. The Halverson cellar failed first. I heard about it from their eldest daughter, who came into the store on the 9th of January with the careful expression of a young woman who has been told to maintain composure and is working hard at it. The potatoes on the north side of their cellar had frozen overnight. Not frost-damaged, not partially frozen, frozen solid, through to the center, a condition from which they would not recover when they thawed. The family's winter potato supply was reduced by roughly a third in a single night. Her father had gone over the cellar that morning looking for the failure point. He had found the plank lining on the north wall showing a gap where the lumber had contracted in the cold, a standard expansion and contraction issue that most cellars experienced without consequence in normal winters, but which in this January had opened a channel for cold to enter that the original construction had not accounted for. He had packed the gap with rags and wood chips. Whether it would hold against the cold that was still coming was a question nobody could answer with confidence. I sold the Halverson girl additional dried beans and a quantity of salt pork. She paid carefully, counting out exactly, and went back out into the cold. The Kowalski cellar failed 2 days later. Different mechanism, same result. Their cabbages went first, brine jars cracked by the expanding ice, the brine itself frozen in the clay, the cabbages inside damaged beyond preservation. Then the turnips along the east wall. Emil Kowalski came in and stood by my stove for 20 minutes without speaking, which was not his way. He was a talkative man, Emil, a man who processed difficulty through conversation, and his silence was more alarming than any specific account of damage would have been. I asked him how much he had lost. He said enough. He said it the way people say things when the word enough is doing a great deal of work that they do not have the capacity to unpack at the moment. By the 3rd week of January, I was keeping a mental count. 7 families had reported cellar failures of varying severity. 2 more had reported no problems yet, but had cellars I knew to be built on the same standard as the ones that had failed, and I thought their confidence was more hope than evidence. Dorothy Crane had come in on the 16th to buy additional dried goods and had mentioned, with the controlled steadiness that was her particular form of distress management, that they had lost 4 bushels of potatoes the previous night. Thomas had examined the cellar and found nothing structurally wrong. No gaps, no cracks, no obvious failure point. The cold had simply penetrated the earth deeply enough and held long enough that the cellar's standard construction was no longer adequate to stop it. She said, "We built it right. Everybody built them right. They were right for the winters we had built them for." I said yes. She stood by the stove for a moment, then she said, "I heard from the Halverson girl that Agnes Tremblay's cellar is holding." I said I had heard the same. She said, "And the Solberg claim?" I said I had not heard otherwise. Dorothy was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that is not the absence of thought but the presence of too much of it, arriving faster than it can be organized. She said, "It is the grass, isn't it? Whatever she was doing with all that grass?" I said I believed so. She said nothing further on the subject. She bought her goods and went back out into the cold, and I watched her wagon move south through the window and thought about the specific difficulty of being a capable woman whose capability has been organized around a set of tools that the current situation has found insufficient. It is a harder place to stand than simple failure. Simple failure at least tells you something clearly. The failure of adequate preparation is more disorienting. It leaves you questioning not what you did, but the entire system of knowledge that told you what to do. It was in those days, while the settlement was doing its arithmetic and not liking the results, that I began to understand something I had been watching without fully seeing. Maren Solberg had not come into my store since the first week of December. She had not sent word through Agnes or any other neighbor. She had not appeared in the informal network of mutual checking in that the cold weather had activated across the settlement, the system of messages and visits that people conducted to make sure nobody was in difficulty without having said so. Her absence from this network was notable. People who were managing adequately still participated in it. The checking in was as much social as practical, a way of maintaining connection across the distances that winter created. People who were in difficulty definitely participated in it, because difficulty required communication. The only people who did not participate were people who had genuinely nothing to report. I had sold Maren 35 bales of grass and lamp oil and wool cord and her ordinary winter supplies. I had watched her drive north in October with a cart loaded with material for a project I had not yet fully understood. I knew from Agnes that she had built something in that cellar that was different from every other cellar in the settlement. And I knew from her absence, from the distress network, while 7 cellars around her were failing, that what she had built was working. She had enough. That was the word Agnes had used, passing it along when I finally sent an inquiry through her. She has enough. In a January that was taking things from people at a rate that frightened everyone who was paying attention, a widow alone on a claim 7 miles north of town had enough. I thought about that word for several days. I thought about the 3 jars of water which Agnes had described to me. I thought about the woman past the lower creek and the cash pit and the dry grass packed to a specific give at a specific thickness. I thought about Maren sitting on that rock 3 separate times before Strikes the Water permitted her to watch. And I thought about something else, something that sat beneath the practicalities like the stable temperature of deep earth beneath the frost line. 7 families in this settlement had lost food in January of 1887. Not because they were careless, not because they were lazy or foolish or unprepared in any ordinary sense of the word. They had built their cellars according to the best available knowledge, the knowledge that had circulated through the settlement, neighbor to neighbor, since the first year anyone had driven a homestead stake into Montana ground. The best available knowledge had not been enough. 2 miles past the lower creek, there had been better knowledge the entire time. There had been better knowledge for 15 years, for 50 years, for longer than any measuring system the settlement used had been applied to this valley. And it had sat there, unheld by anyone in the settlement, unused by anyone in the settlement, because the settlement had made a determination about what knowledge was worth having and where it was likely to reside, and that determination had cost 7 families a portion of their winter food supply and was going to cost more before the month was out. The second cold wave had not finished yet. January was not finished. The worst of it was still 3 days away, arriving from the north with a patience that the ducks on the creek had understood in October, and that we were only now, in the 3rd week of January, beginning to comprehend fully. Maren Solberg's cellar was holding. The cold had found her walls and stopped there, as she had intended it to stop. 4 inches of still air, trapped in dry grass that could not move, that could not carry heat outward or cold inward, that did nothing, and in doing nothing did everything she had needed it to do. The rest of us were burning through our wood piles and wrapping our losses in the controlled language of people managing what could not be changed. And Agnes Tremblay was riding south with her youngest child on her hip, and 3 more children behind her on a horse that knew the trail, riding toward the one place in the settlement that had something left to offer. Agnes arrived on a Thursday. She came with her youngest on her hip and her 3 older children behind her on the brown mare, all of them dressed in every layer the cabin had offered, and she rode into Maren's yard with the particular quietness of a woman who has already had the harder conversation with herself and is now simply executing what that conversation required. Maren opened the door before Agnes reached it. She did not ask what had happened. She looked at Agnes and at the children and stepped back from the doorway and said, in her careful English, "Come in and eat first. Then we will talk about the rest." The cellar had not been built for 5 people. Maren's winter stores had been calculated for 1 woman through April, with a margin she had built in deliberately because she understood that margins were not luxuries in Montana winters, but the difference between a plan and a wish. That margin, she now understood, had been built for exactly this kind of arithmetic, the kind where someone you trusted arrived at your door and the numbers needed to change. She fed the children that evening from the stores she had been eating from herself. Cornmeal and dried apples, and the last of a smoked pork side she had been rationing carefully. The children ate without speaking much, which told her more about the previous weeks than anything Agnes might have said. Agnes put the youngest down on a folded blanket near the stove and came and sat across the table from Maren and said, "The brine jars cracked in the 2nd week. I didn't want to say anything until I knew how bad it was going to get. I thought I could manage it. Then I looked at what was left, and I did the arithmetic, and I came here." Maren said, "You should have come sooner." Agnes said, "I know. I was hoping I was wrong about the arithmetic." Maren said, "You were not wrong about the arithmetic. But the stores will hold for all of us if we are careful." "We will be careful." Agnes looked at her for a moment with the expression of a woman receiving something she had not expected to receive and is not entirely sure she has earned. Then she looked around the cabin, at the stove burning at its modest, steady level, at the room which was warm in a way that the Tremblay cabin had not been warm in 3 weeks, at the door with its wool-padded frame and its inner curtain hung 2 feet inside the entrance. She said, "I want to understand what you built. I want to understand all of it before I go home." Maren said yes. "Tomorrow when there is light." The morning was the coldest of the winter. Agnes would tell me later that when Maren opened the outer cellar door, the air that came out of the vestibule was cold, but not the same cold as the air outside. It was the cold of deep earth, of stable ground, of temperature held rather than driven. They went through the inner door together and stood in the cellar, and Agnes looked at the grass-lined walls and the slat framework holding them in place, and the bins of vegetables ranged along the center of the floor, away from the walls, in the still air that the grass had protected all winter. Maren pulled a carrot from the nearest bin. She handed it to Agnes without ceremony, the way you hand someone a tool when you want them to understand what it does. Agnes held it for a long time. It was firm. It was the orange of a carrot that had been kept correctly, not the pale, softening orange of a carrot that had gotten too cold or too warm, not the gray-tinged color of a carrot that had frozen and recovered. It was simply a carrot in January in Montana, as sound as the day it had gone into the ground the previous autumn. Agnes said nothing for a while. Then she asked, "How tightly did you pack the grass?" This was the right question. Not how does it work or why does it work, but what is the specific parameter that makes the difference between working and not working? Maren looked at her with the expression I imagine she reserved for moments when someone exceeded her expectations, which was not a common expression on Maren Solberg's face. She pressed her palm against the nearest wall and gestured for Agnes to do the same. Agnes pressed, felt the give, the interior resistance, the depth of air trapped in dry fiber. Maren said, "Not hard. If you press hard, you lose the air. The air is the thing." Agnes pressed again, testing the range of it, feeling where firm became compressed. She nodded slowly, the nod of a woman encoding information for future use. She said, "I want to build this when I go home." Maren said, "I will help you build it, and you will teach it to the others. Your English is better than mine. You will explain it more cleanly." Agnes looked at her. Agnes. She understood what was being asked, not just the technical transmission, but the social one, the task of moving an idea through a community that had particular ideas about which directions knowledge traveled and which directions it did not. She said, "I will tell them where it came from strikes the water, every time." Maren said, "Good. That matters more than the rest." Agnes and the children stayed 11 days. The worst of the cold broke in the final week of January, not into warmth, but into something more bearable, the specific relief of a temperature that merely required management rather than survival. Agnes went home and began her cellar in February, working with lumber salvaged from a fallen outbuilding and grass she had in the barn from her own hay stores. Maren rode over twice to check the work and adjust the packing density on the east wall where Agnes had pressed too firmly, the same error Maren had made on her own north wall, the same correction, the same patient repacking. The knowledge was moving, quietly, at 2 miles per trip, in the ordinary language of neighbors, comparing construction notes. Thomas Crane came to the Solberg claim on the first Thursday of February. He did not come alone. He brought Dorothy, and he brought 2 members of the Land Committee, a man named Forsyth, who held 3 adjacent claims to the south and who had been present at the discussion about the widow Solberg the previous autumn, and a younger man named Dills, who kept careful records of homestead status and improvement dates. They came in Thomas's large wagon, with the stated purpose of conducting a general welfare check of the outlying claims, of which the Solberg property was the northernmost. Maren received them in the yard. She was feeding her chickens, wearing her wool dress and a heavy shawl, moving with the unhurried efficiency of a woman whose morning was proceeding according to its ordinary schedule. The cold had moderated enough to be workable. Her woodpile, visible from the yard, was substantially intact. More wood remaining in February than most households in the settlement had managed to preserve. Thomas noted the woodpile. He noted it in the way that men note things they had not expected to see and are recalibrating their understanding of. Maren invited them inside. She made coffee on a stove that was burning at a modest, economical level, not the roaring fire that most households were running in February simply to stay functional, but a steady, managed burn that was maintaining the room at a temperature she had clearly decided was adequate and was not feeding beyond what adequate required. Dorothy looked at the stove. She looked at the room temperature, which was perceptibly warmer than the room she had been moving through for the past 2 months. She looked at Maren. Maren asked if they would like to see the cellar. She took them all down. Agnes was there, having arrived that morning to finish the adjustments on the technique she was learning. Agnes, who stood in the corner of the cellar, with the calm of a woman who belongs in a room and knows it, in a group that included 2 men who had spent the autumn discussing the disposition of the Solberg land claim. Thomas Crane stood in the cellar and looked at the walls and at the bins of food that should not have been there in the condition it was in. Forsyth reached out and touched the grass and looked at his hand as though expecting to find something on it. Dills stood near the door and did not say anything, and had the expression of a man who is updating a considerable number of assumptions simultaneously. Dorothy pulled a carrot from the bin. She held it the way Agnes had held it, not examining it exactly, but receiving it, the firmness of it, the color of it, the simple, irrefutable fact of it in February. She set it back carefully. Thomas asked, "How much wood have you burned this winter?" Maren said, "A little more than 4 cords." The men were quiet. Everyone in that cellar knew what their own households had burned. Forsyth had burned 8. Dills had burned 7. Thomas Crane, with a house twice the size of this cabin and 2 stoves and a hired man to keep them fed, had burned 11 cords by the 1st of February and was calculating how much he had left. Dorothy said quietly, "Who taught you this?" Maren said, "Strikes the water. The Crow woman passed the lower creek. She has been building these for longer than this settlement has existed. Agnes is building one now. Agnes will explain it to anyone who wants to build their own." Nobody said anything about the land. Nobody raised the question of the Solberg claim or the spring conversation that Thomas had been planning. Forsyth looked at his hands. Dills looked at his notebook without opening it. Thomas looked at the wall with its 4 inches of packed grass, and the thin pine slats holding it in place, and the still air behind it that had done what 11 cords of burning wood had not quite managed to do. They drank the coffee and left without much ceremony. Maren watched their wagon move south and went back inside and sat for a moment at the table without doing anything in particular. Agnes said, "They will build it." Maren said yes. Agnes said, "They won't say where it came from." Maren was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You will say where it came from. That is enough." By the autumn of 1887, 11 families in Bitterroot Crossing had rebuilt their cellars. Agnes taught the construction to each of them, demonstrating the packing pressure with her hands, explaining the vestibule, naming strikes the water each time anyone asked about the origin. Some people listened to that part carefully. Some did not. The technique moved faster than the attribution, as techniques generally do. Strikes the Water died in the spring of 1888. Peacefully, in her camp, in the early warmth of a May morning that followed the longest and most tested winter the valley had known, Maren was with her. She had gone out to check on her as the snow released, riding the trail past the lower creek that she had ridden 3 times in October of 1886 before the old woman had permitted her to sit and watch. She sat with her at the end, holding a hand that had packed grass into cache pit walls for 50 years in Montana ground. Strikes the Water said something near the end in Apsaluk, the word or words that Maren had heard once before, the sound that might have meant still or grass, or the air inside something that cannot move, or all three together in a way the language held as one thing. Maren held her hand until there was nothing left to hold. Then she rode to the settlement and told the minister that Strikes the Water had died and gave the name carefully, spelling it when he hesitated over it. He wrote it down. The record was lost in a courthouse fire in 1904, and the name went with it. Only my ledger remained. I told all of this to Calvin Marsh on that August afternoon in 1921, while the light through the store window moved from midday to afternoon, and his notebook filled with the careful handwriting of a young man trying to hold more than he had expected to carry. When I finished, he looked at what he had written for a moment. Then he looked up and asked, "Is she still alive, Maren Solberg?" I said, "Maren Järvinen. She remarried in 1891. She is 72 years old, and she is on her claim 7 miles north of here. And the cellar she built in October of 1886 is still standing and still lined with grass and still holding at 36 degrees in the coldest part of winter because nobody has found a reason to change what works." He asked if he could speak to her. I said I thought she would see him if he went respectfully and did not take too much of her time, and wrote down the name Strikes the Water before he asked a single question about Maren Solberg. He asked why the name first. I told him because the name first is the difference between telling the story correctly and telling it conveniently, and this story had been told conveniently for long enough. I opened my ledger to the entry from the autumn of 1884 and showed him what I had written there. Strikes the Water, willow bark, November. Then I showed him the entry from December of 1886 where I had written the name again, next to a notation I did not explain to him, because some things you write down for yourself rather than for anyone who will come later to read them. He copied both entries into his notebook. I made a copy of the relevant ledger pages for him before he left, pressing them flat and folding them into an envelope I had been keeping behind the counter for no particular reason for several years, as though I had known something would eventually require it. I do not think I had known. But I had kept the envelope, and I had kept the ledger, and I had kept every name in it with the same care I kept inventory counts and payment records, because I had understood from my first years in business that the most important things to write down are the ones that nobody else is writing down. Calvin Marsh drove north in his automobile toward the Järvinen claim. I watched the dust settle behind him on the road through Bitterroot Crossing, and then I went back to my invoices. Outside, the mountains were going gold in the late summer light, and the road was empty in both directions, and somewhere under every well-built cellar in this valley, 4 inches of still air was doing what it had always done. Nothing. In the most useful possible sense of the word.